Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our MNA weekly webcast, Ministry in Action, Setting Up Disaster Response Sites. You are joined by Keith Perry, MNA Disaster Response Specialist for Florida, and Rick Lenz, MNA Disaster Response Specialist in the South Central region, will be joining us a little later. I'd like to open us up with a word of prayer, and then we will get started. And this is a very timely webcast. And if you have friends who you want to send a text or give a phone call, tell them to join us on Facebook, because this is something that you are going to want to hear. So let me start us with a word of prayer, please. Most kind and gracious Father, we just thank you for the opportunity that you give us to do these websites each week. They're opportunities, Father, for us to serve the church, Lord, and to educate them. And also, Lord, for you to be glorified, which is the most important thing. So, Father, I ask that you would be with us during this time today. I thank you, Father, that you gave Keith the ability to have time in his schedule to be with us, when we know that so many times the disaster response people are not able to join us because they're out there working. So Father, I thank you for him, and I thank you for Rick. I ask you, Father God, that you would just keep Rick as he prepares to come and join us a little bit later. And I just ask you, Father, that all of those that are attending today, Father God, that they would hear and learn something, Father God, that they will be able to take back to their churches and their presbyteries about setting up disaster response sites. Father, thank you for this opportunity, and we ask all of this in your name. Amen. Well, Keith, thank you again for being here. I appreciate you making time in your schedule. I know how busy you usually are, but I want you to tell people just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into talking more about disaster response.
Okay, well, I've been with MNA in the disaster response ministry 12 plus years, since 2008. And before that, I was an engineer manager for a large aerospace company. Spent 36 years in that industry before I retired in 2015 to do something that was more joyful to me, and that's work with the MNA Disaster Response full time. In that time, I started as a volunteer in 2004, and I didn't know what MNA DR was. And in 2005, we all got to know MNA DR and our friends and brothers and sisters in Christ on the Gulf Coast in Biloxi and Gulfport, and went as a volunteer there. And a couple of years later, Arkley issued a call for me to join his staff, which I did, and just had some great years learning and teaching about DR. And then 2015, when I retired, God had a plan for me, because for the next 4.5 years, I was gone from my home. 4 years of that 4.5 years, helping folks in South Carolina and Panama City and Baton Rouge, just responding and setting up sites and helping the churches and their communities recover from disasters, from floods and hurricanes and the like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we have Rick Lenz, who has joined us. And Rick is the disaster response specialist for the South Central region. And Rick, I'm going to ask you if you would just share a little bit about yourself, and then we will get into really talking more about disaster response.
I spent 23 years in the Air Force. My first assignment was to go to school at Keesler Air Force Base, admin officer school. And of course, that's when Hurricane Camille hit. So I had a little bit of experience. I experienced a hurricane firsthand at Keesler Air Force Base, and went out with crews to do some various work. And after I retired, I spent 17 years as a financial advisor. And I think it was 2008, our church in Fort Worth sent a team up to Iowa after the flooding in Des Moines area. And or Cedar Rapids, I mean. And after we got back, we got to thinking, why wouldn't it would have been better if we had more teams from the Presbytery attend? And so put out the call, and we had 7-8 churches that responded, and we formed a Presbytery committee on disaster response. They adopted our plan, our Presbytery plan, our church plan, our family plan, which the Presbytery plan, I think, has been adopted now in 14 presbyteries. And then after that, I was asked to come on staff. So I'm coming up on 11 years of completing that.
Thank you. And I know both of you are actively involved in many of the disasters that happen, but I know this time of year is what is considered the beginning of storm season. But can you explain that to us?
Let me jump in here, Keith. It's the beginning. We just had a storm here in Texas and Oklahoma. We had 14 of our churches flooded, which affected 15 churches, 3 pastors' homes because of the extremely cold weather. It got to 3 below here in Dallas, which is unusual. And so a lot of pipes, water pipes and sprinkler systems burst. So we have 3 or 4 churches that were badly damaged and a couple of pastors' homes. So while it's the start of the storm season, we're reacting to a disaster right now.
Now, with that type of disaster, will you go in and provide disaster response care to them? Or how does that happen? Is that different from if you respond to a different type of disaster?
Yes, it is. We call between Mark Becker, the associate in our region, and we called all the churches that we could get in contact with to get an assessment, and they're all covered by insurance, although some of the churches and pastors were facing a fairly high deductible. So we immediately, there were churches and individuals around the United States that wanted to help financially. So we are able to connect that donation with those churches through grants to help them cover some of those deductibles.
Okay, so the response is not always the physical care. Sometimes it is the helping them with the financial needs that they have.
Right, and we did have some volunteers from various churches here in the Dallas area go to, for instance, Bethel in North Dallas and help them move furniture and clean up. But most of it was done by the various volunteers from those churches.
Okay. Now, Keith, let me go to you. When we talk about storm season, if you can define that for us a little bit more.
Well, for me, storm season runs between June 1st and November 30th, which is hurricane season. I'm down in Florida, and that's my region. And that's where most of our disasters occurs during that storm season. Although we do have occasional tornadoes and flooding outside of those months. But, you know, in spring, all across the country, you have tornadoes that happen. But that's the major season for basically all the East Coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast, from Brownsville, Texas, all the way up to Newfoundland, Canada.
Yeah, for those people that experience the tornadoes that you said sometimes they have, is there a certain area of the country or a certain region where you see more of the tornadoes?
Well, yeah, the Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, the Southeast range, if you remember last Easter, about a year ago, well, actually about a year ago this week, Nashville had a tornado that went through downtown. And then less than a month later on Easter Sunday, they had that large outbreak that had tornadoes from Texas all the way to North Carolina in one storm system. So we had deployments. I went to Heidelberg, Mississippi, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Seneca, South Carolina, all to help them get their local efforts started amid this COVID effort, or COVID, the pandemic that was going on, so that we weren't really able to bring in outside help for those folks, volunteers from other communities.
Yeah, and it's been unusual too the last few years. I mean, we had a tornado in the Dallas area the day after Christmas. They had tornadoes up in Washington, Illinois, when there was snow on the ground. So it used to be, it was mainly in the springtime when the weather was changing and you had cold fronts and warm fronts colliding. But now it's a little bit less predictable.
Yeah, but also disasters are not necessarily weather-based. They could, we've actually helped churches who's got caught fire and had fire damage, as well as flooding from freezing pipes and things.
And I responded to the fertilizer plant explosion in West Texas.
Yeah.
Represented the Texas Volunteer Organization active in disaster on the emergency operations console there, or center, which was unusual because you had the FBI and Homeland Security and everybody else there, because they weren't sure if it was a domestic terrorism, which it wasn't. But
now let me ask this question, because I know that you guys are not the only two disaster response specialists, because you would have to be Superman to be all over. How many disaster response specialists do we have? And do you know the different regions that they're located in?
Yeah, we have Mark Willett, who's up in the Mid-Atlantic region. He's out of Virginia, Hopewell, Virginia. We have Andy Eisenbaum, who's in St. Louis. He has kind of the Midwest region. You've got Mike Kinnemer, who's has the Tennessee, Northern Alabama, Northern Georgia region. And Rick is in the Texas, Oklahoma area. And then we have Evan Scroggs, who's got the Gulf Coast, which is basically from Mobile to Texas, Louisiana and Mississippi coastline, and into the States. And then myself, I have all of Florida.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm fortunate that I have Mark Becker, ruling elder down at Christ Katy near Houston, to be an associate, because we do have 123 churches, including the Korean Southern Presbytery. And we have five major presbyteries, plus a couple churches from the Rio Grande Presbytery.
Okay. Well, let me ask this question, and I'm going to direct this one to Keith, and then Rick, if you want to jump in. What actually goes into the pre-planning before disaster?
Well, pre-planning is kind of a broad term. We like to have as many churches take training to form a team, whether it be chainsaw, debris removal, site management, reconstruction, all the various skill sets that we like to train before a storm. And then as a storm is approaching, a hurricane or a large front, we track the weather, we communicate to the different churches and presbyteries that are in the path of the storm to see if they're preparing and what they may need if something's would happen. We do a lot of just communication to make sure that everybody's aware of what is going on and that there is somebody out there that's willing to come in and help.
So Rick, you say when there's a disaster has occurred, what would be for the person like me sitting at home and I want to help, what would be the first thing you would say I should do?
I would say pray. Pray for those volunteering, pray that for the responders, pray for the people that are in disaster's way, pray for the churches and their leaders that they would be able to respond not only to their members and frequent visitors, but also to the community. And just pray that in everything that we do, we're giving glory to God. A second thing would be, we say pray, give, and go, would be to donate supplies, equipment, funds to help those people respond. And then go would be to volunteer and actually go or help volunteers. I mean, you might be in a where you can't deploy, but you could maybe help with transportation for those deploying or sending meals with them. When we went up to Iowa, there were some ladies who made a whole bunch of casseroles. And if you're going to respond to a disaster, do it in Louisiana because they always feed you. We had I don't know how many casseroles donated, hundreds in Lake Charles, the same in Baton Rouge when we were there, and they were just delicious.
Tracy, one other thing to do prior to a storm, if you're thinking you could deploy, is register with MNA Disaster Response as a volunteer. We have on our website, we have a link to start that registration process, which is filling out your name and contact information, and then also getting a background check. All adults from 18 and above are required to have a public records background check, which is performed by a third party, which is available through those links on our website, so that you're prepared to go at a moment's notice. And that background check is good for about 2.5, 3 years before it has to be done again. So once you do it, you're just ready to go to that. And Sherry Lanier is our administrator who coordinates our volunteer deployments. And once a disaster happens and we announce that we need volunteers at a particular site, you contact her via her email, slanier@pcanet.org, to say, I want to go, and here's when I can go, and she will work with you to schedule you so that we have beds available, food available, and work available for you when you arrive.
And the website address is www.pcamna.org. Go to MNA Ministries and then go to MNA Disaster Response. And that's where you will find the registration for the volunteers.
Right.
Now, one question I do have for you, when you get ready to go to a site, you determine that among your team that yes, they do need help and they need people to come in. Do you have to coordinate that with the local authorities, or can you just go in? How does that work?
Well, we have a few teams that we know that their skill sets, and they go in immediately after a storm before MNADR sets up a volunteer site to help the local churches and community and their members and then their community dig out, pull trees off of houses, open up, pull trees out the front door so they can get access to their property, and help assess the damage level so that we can work with the local leadership to determine whether or not outside help is needed, and if it is, what that help looks like. In Lake Charles, after Hurricane Laura, the need was hands and feet to come help clean debris, run chainsaws, and remove trees from houses. And we set up a volunteer site with a couple of bunkhouses, a shower trailer, tool sheds, and we have had worked with the church. Bethel Presbyterian Church invited us in, and we set up a relief site there. And then through the scheduling, teams came in, and the site manager there then found work through the church, through the community, to get these teams out into the community to work in the cleanup effort.
Yeah,
Okay, now, Keith, you mentioned site managers. Rick, can you tell us what is a site manager? You know, what are the qualifications? What they do? I would assume if I think about it, you wouldn't want me as a site manager. So can you let us know, what does a site manager do?
well, yeah, if they're breathing, they can be a site manager. No, I mean, it's good to have somebody with organizational skills. It's good to have somebody with some background. We were going to have training for site managers because we desperately need them to spell site managers like Keith. You know, to work at a place away from home for months at a time can get tiring, and plus you have other commitments. So it's good to have somebody that can come in and be a backup, as Mark and Becker and his wife Susan did, which was great. But he had experience, or they had experience before over in Houston after Harvey, working with their local church. One of the members has a great outreach program. So it would be good to train people. One of the problems we have is the site manager is required to do quite a few things. Some of it is doing the assessments, going out and seeing what needs to be done and whether we can do it. Scheduling the volunteers, welcoming them, coordinating, getting them settled and that sort of thing. Running supplies, getting supplies, running equipment out. So ideally we'd have like 3 or 4 people, and a site manager, maybe an assistant, and then 2 or 3 other people that could help. But they do a lot of things. And then with the pandemic, there was some extra things required in cleaning and watching distance and that sort of thing, wearing masks when we work, where we probably wouldn't have needed masks. In a lot of places we do need masks when we're cleaning up.
So have you been able really to do the number of trainings that you want to do or normally like to do during the pandemic? Have you used technology to do that, or how have you done that?
We haven't been able to do a lot of general training to invite folks from from all over the South country to come into our training facility at our warehouse in Rome, Georgia, because of the pandemic. But there has been a few training sessions at local churches where they've set up their own rules, for social distancing, masks, and all of that, so that we could come in and do PowerPoint training, but we haven't really taken advantage of the technology because chainsaw training is a little hard to do virtually.
We also put together a site manager manual along with some tools and that sort of thing that we're still coordinating on that. So we hope to have that out fairly soon so that we can get that out to people, and regional specialists like us can maybe have regional training. And we encourage people, volunteers that come in, to maybe perhaps do a little training while they're there on site management and kind of shadow us as we go through those. And a site manager, if he has some help, he or she has some help, they don't necessarily have to be the ones that go out and do work, or maybe even, when I was in Birmingham area after the tornadoes there, the pastor was answering all the phone calls, and he was busy. And I said, why don't you get somebody to come in? So he got a guy in a wheelchair that came in. The guy just loved it. He was able to be productive. He could, channel phone calls to me or the pastor. He could do a lot of different things. So there's room for everybody in disaster response.
Amen.
I like that. There's room for everyone at disaster response. I like that. That's very true. Now, I have a question for you. How do you find most of your volunteers? Do you guys recruit them, or do you find that most of them come through the website? They just register when there's a disaster that has occurred?
Well, most of the volunteers register because they heard there was a need, a call for volunteers. We've had over the last 5 years, we've probably had 10,000 plus volunteers come through the different disaster sites. Some of them are people we knew from previous disasters where they come again. For Hurricane Sally and Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta, I recruited some of my favorite teams out of Florida to help, especially in the Hurricane Sally, which hit the Pensacola Mobile area. I would call my people I knew that had volunteer teams, say, hey, can you get a team and come help? We need you. But most of them come through the site, through the advertisement, through our communications coming out through MNA Disaster Response out to the denomination.
And we put out the word regionally, like Keith did, and encourage teams. We had teams from College Station that responded 5 or 6 times, from the Katy area that responded, quite a few people from Beaumont, which just across the border from Lake Charles. There's a lot of people that want to volunteer, and if they have the time, I mean, we all had our favorite teams from around the states, from Pennsylvania to New Jersey in North Carolina, Texas, Florida. Once they hear the need, they respond.
I had a team during Hurricane Irma a couple of years ago, drove from northern Michigan straight through to come down to help in Marco Island, to help for a long weekend. So they drove about 24 hours to help for 48, and then they drove back.
Wow.
That's the help. They just felt the call and they came, and they were a great chainsaw team.
Wonderful. That is wonderful to hear. Now, when you guys heard of a disaster, I know that you don't instantly just pick up and go. What do you do as a team back on your site to determine whether or not you're going to respond physically?
Well, we communicate with the local leadership, the senior pastors, the elders, the sessions, the leader of the presbyteries, to determine, is there really a need? Hurricane Sally was a terrible storm, but the local presbytery was organized, and after Hurricane Michael, they had lots of experience in organization. They were able to handle the response within the presbytery. They did not need outside help, although a few teams that wanted to travel a long distance to Lake Charles, we waved them over to Pensacola to help. Well, then in Lake Charles, we talked to the local leadership, and they wanted help. They needed help, and then that's when we put out the word that we're going to need help, sign up, schedule a time, and then we've set a series of steps together so we can get equipment in place to support our volunteers, which included bringing bunkhouses and heavy equipment from our warehouse in Rome and our depot in Dallas.
Okay, can you tell me about your warehouse and your depot? What does that mean? What's there?
Okay, I'll talk to the Rome warehouse, and I'll let Rick talk to the Dallas depot. In Rome, we've established a 15,000 square foot training facility and warehouse there where we store some of our rolling stock, which includes bunkhouses, shower trailers, flatbed trailers, and our heavy equipment, skid steers that we have purchased. And now we've just purchased generators and fuel, portable fuel tanks to go along with the generators. That's where we store, maintain, so that when a disaster occurs and a site is going to be set up, we logistically move that equipment as needed, plus general supplies. We have flood buckets, which contain cleaning supplies for after a flood, hygiene kits, for folks who are, without water and power, tools, hand tools, power tools that are needed to do the work that we've called for, including chainsaws. That's all housed there and ready to be shipped when there's a need to support a site. That's the main function of it, but the second function is the Charles H. Jones Disaster Response Warehouse in Rome. Also has about 2,400 square feet of training facility that we're trying to use. So we get a call from us, from the site manager, the setup, whoever's setting up the site, to we need this equipment. This is where we're going to put it. This is how we're going to use it, and set it down there.
And at the Dallas Depot, we're about 4 blocks south of Love Field. So, and the Williams Company has graciously allowed us to use 9,000 square feet. We have, as Keith mentioned, bunkhouse trailers, 2 bunkhouse trailers, 2 shower trailers, 2 flatbed trailers, 4 enclosed trailers, a F-350 pickup, forklift, a small Bobcat, and other generators, dehumidifiers, flood buckets, a lot of supplies and equipment. And because of that pre-positioning, we can respond a lot quicker than we could 11 years ago when I started this. At the beginning of MNA Disaster Response, we were mainly sending volunteers. Now we can, through our logistics manager there at Rome, Georgia, we can get, and he can get equipment from here or there out fairly quickly so that we can set up and have a more robust response.
Yeah, I do remember the beginning of disaster response, and the first one I think the answer to was in Katrina, and because they didn't have the equipment, they were going out and buying chainsaws, and people were bringing what they had. So when you see that warehouse, you see how the Lord has really blessed and used the donations of people who have an interest in this ministry of disaster response. But I have a question for you from Timothy. He's a PCA teaching elder and Army chaplain. His wife and he and his wife signed up for site director training, and it was right prior to the pandemic. Do you have any idea when the training will be rescheduled? Because they would hope to be very involved in DR upon his upcoming retirement.
I don't know. It has not been rescheduled. We're praying that we'll be able to do it sooner than later. For that, in terms of if he separates and retires before our training, he's more than welcome to get on the job training. as he could shadow one of our site managers at the next disaster.
Okay, so what would you suggest at this point would be the best thing for him to do to get his name on the list and to be before? Should he register, or since it's the training he's interested in, should he contact your administrator?
Yes, he should go ahead and register as a volunteer. Get that out of the way. So if the training doesn't occur before the next disaster, he'll be just be able to sign up and go. Contact Sherry and say he's interested in the training and would like to be on the list of people to be invited when we schedule again. Now, part of that in being invited, we would like a note from the senior pastor at his church to say that he's really serious in this, because we're going to put a lot of effort in training when we have it. So we want folks who really want to do it, are really going to commit to it, to sign up first. And as we move along, we'll open it up to the greater people who are just a little interested as we get our, team together as site managers for the next set of disasters.
Yeah, and I would be glad to talk to the person too, to kind of give them and I'm sure Keith would too, give an idea what's involved, what things they would need to do and be responsible for. For instance, I met with a couple. They had been missionaries overseas and now they're retired and they want to do some things. They're coming to the Dallas Depot in April. Mike Kinnemer will be coming out here. We're going to be giving some training on the Bobcat. We'll have 9 or 10 people, but I met with them. We talked about being a site manager, what it involves, and I'd be glad to talk to that person. He can give me a call.
I'll get you his information so you can connect through email initially.
Great.
One question I do want to ask is, and I want to make sure that we cover this, is when a church and their congregation has been affected by a disaster, and most, I would probably say, are not prepared for it. How many of them, I shouldn't say how many of them, but how has that impacted them to ask disaster response to come and help us develop a policy or some guidelines of how to be prepared when a disaster does hit?
Well, we would love, all of the specialists would just love to come visit the church and talk over how to do that pre-planning, how to set up a disaster plan for a church or the presbytery. We do have a kind of a template for a presbytery level plan that is very simple to modify to fit to a presbytery to begin with, and then get it for the MNA committee within a presbytery to tweak it if they need to get it in that, to get it approved by the presbytery, and then it forms a small committee under the presbytery to go off and make sure they have the communications to all the churches. Each one of us would love to do that. We're more than happy to travel or do it virtually via a Zoom meeting to go through, share, talk about the nuances that some presbyteries have added and what has happened. That's what we would like to do to help a church get ready, because as I mentioned earlier, it was the Gulf Coast Presbytery, which is the panhandle of Florida. Just a year prior to Michael, they adopted the plan, formed the committee, got the communications started, got it all together just months before the storm. And the first time they had to use it, it worked. Presbytery got together to help the 3 churches in Panama City that were devastated by the storm, able to work with us to funnel funds, volunteers, and material into the area, help us set the site up and help the churches recover from that disaster. So that planning really worked out. And then when Sally hit, that same plan allowed them to manage that disaster on their own without a lot of outside help. They did not need MNA to come in and bring a lot of equipment and stuff. They had what they needed to do the work, which was great. I was in Lake Charles.
And one of the things we try to do in our region is to have a disaster response coordinator at every church, somebody other than the pastor. That can be the eyes on the ground. That can be really helpful. Right now, of the 123 churches, we have around 70. We'd really like to get that up closer to 100. And that would be churches and church plants, and realizing that some of the church plants wouldn't be able to do that yet. But it's really helpful. And that person can also generate interest in praying for a mission, also, or for a ministry, also for donations and volunteers and that sort of thing. And again, that person doesn't have to be the one that would deploy, but could help organize and then give us an assessment before we go out there, if we need to go out there to look at it to see whether we're going to respond.
Okay. Well, okay. So I am interested in my church having you come, or doing it virtually and doing the pre-planning and the template and everything. Who do I contact for that?
Well, if you have a regional specialist in your area, that would be the person I would contact.
Okay.
And then we could set that up. Depending on the situation, we could, in our region, we could actually go there, maintaining distance. Of course, I've had both my shots. You know, before all of this, we did training sessions. We did breakfasts. Mark, for instance, Becker is scheduled to do a presentation to the Houston Metro in their next meeting. He's going over to Victoria to do a presentation. So that would be the person I would contact, somebody in the regional specialist in that area, or contact Sherry and she'll line up somebody if they don't have one in that area.
Right.
Okay. And they can find out who the regional specialists are by going to the website at www.pcamna.org and then going to disaster response, correct?
Right.
Okay. And how do you guys work with other organizations when you're on site?
We work with a lot of organizations that are on site. MNADR is part of an organization. We've joined an organization called Volunteers Active in Disasters, or VOAD for short. There's a national organization in which Arkley is our representative. Arkley and Sherry are representative to the national organization. Rick and myself are to our local. I'm to the Florida VOAD organization. All our specialists are members of the regional VOADs. And through that, Red Cross, Samaritan's Purse, Salvation Army, Methodist, Baptist, even there's some Buddhist organizations, and a lot of volunteer organizations, a lot of charities that are active in volunteers get together through conference calls and meetings in the disaster area to share what they have. We have extra supplies. Do you need them? Or we need help doing this work. Do you have volunteers that can do that work? Plus, we go around and visit our fellow volunteers, fellow workers in the disaster site to get to know them, to figure out if they have equipment that we don't have for a particular job, or they could do it, and we share work orders and the like.
Yeah, for instance, in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, I visited Samaritan's Purse. They were set up at a church that is now a PCA church, Evangelical Presbyterian Church in Houston. And they were already coordinating with the local church, Christ the King there in Houston. They were already giving jobs to the local responders. We also worked with the Baptist, Second Baptist there. They had a lot of work orders and they couldn't get to them all, so they would refer them to us. In the wildfires up here in North Dallas a few years ago, work with the Baptist men. We couldn't work on the same job site because we weren't trained by them, which is also something with us. We typically do not work on the same job site with other volunteers because they need to come through us and be registered. But up there, they came in and they cut up these mobile homes that had been burned, cut up the frames, and then we came in, they'd tell us, and we'd go back in and haul them out so they could be picked up. So we worked together very closely to avoid duplication of effort, help supply something that they may need. And it's good too, because Salvation Army and Red Cross feed us sometimes when we initially get in there.
Yes, yes, they do.
Well, I want to ask you to each, if you would, please, share a story about once you went to a disaster response site and someone who was a victim of the disaster. What did you experience with that person?
Yeah, I've got a story from Baton Rouge during the flood. There was a gentleman who considered himself a giver. He always was the one that volunteered. He was always the one that offered help. But yet he was standing in his house with 18 inches of water going around in circles, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to ask for help, because he was always the one giving help. His church showed up in large numbers to help save his furniture. And then I was there the Sunday after the flood, and he approached me and kind of like hat in hand, with great humility, kind of wanted to ask for help, didn't know how to ask for help. And I just listened to him and said, I'll be there tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock and we'll see what happens from there. And I showed up. When I said I was, we talked, we looked at his damage, and we were able to schedule teams to come into his home for the next 3 to 6 weeks to rebuild his home, put in flooring, put in drywall, paint, put his furniture back together, get him set up so he was back to normal. And since then, he has hauled sheds for us from his church to Lake Charles. He has coordinated shed building at his church. He has really found that somebody reaching out to him in Christ to help him was something he never expected would ever happen. It touched him, and now he wants to give back to the next disaster. And he has just been a blessing to his church in getting our Sheds of Hope kit buildings set up at their church in Baton Rouge, which has been a great blessing to the southeast coast from Lake Charles and in that area, and bringing sheds to disaster sites.
That's a beautiful story. Beautiful. Rick, do you have a story of when you came onto a site and there was a victim how they just approached you, or they were wondering how they could get help?
Well, we have a lot of stories after each one. I guess they're in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. One of the things is finding jobs, and you might have a bunch of volunteers coming in, and you have to have like 1.5 times or 2 times the amount of jobs you think they can do to make sure you keep them busy, because you can't have somebody travel 24 hours driving and then get there and say, oh, we don't have anything for you today. So we look on different things like crisis cleanup out of Hattiesburg. And so there were some jobs in Houston. I had some volunteers coming in, and some people aren't ready for us to come in, members or something like that. So, you have to make sure that you keep them busy. This one dear lady, I called her up, and so I went out there, and she had flooded. She was a widow. Her brother lived at the house. He was severely crippled in a truck accident. And we ended up tearing out the subflooring and putting in new flooring. John Brown did that, our former Sheds of Hope guy. He put in new cabinets. We had teams come in, and that was the neat part. It was teams would come in, and they'd say, well, what are we going to do here? And somebody would say, well, why don't I put up some fans in their house? So this one guy says, I'm an electrician. He put up fans in the house. Another location, one of our pastors up in the Woodlands, associate pastor was our site manager. He was working on a house of this lady who had a lot of needs, and a team came in. They were not PCA, but they volunteered through us. They came in, and the guy says, what are you going to do with the garage door? And he said, well, we'd like to replace it, but he said, I got 37 years of experience. So they went out and bought a garage door. They went out and bought a huge sliding glass door and replaced, so teams come in, they rent equipment, they rent stuff, they buy stuff. Some of them fly in, they buy a bunch of equipment and then leave it with us. So that's how we get some of our equipment, which is great. But this lady in Houston, we built a shed for her to get some of the stuff out. And another story that somebody came in right after the flood and talked her into her FEMA money to put carpeting in her 3 bedrooms. It was still wet under the floor. He said, well, it'll probably be a little wet. Well, no kidding. So after this last flood down there, a couple of people from Covenant Church down there went in and tore all of that up and has put in new flooring there. We bought her some appliances. We completely redid 3 homes there. In Joplin, we built 5 brand new homes. So it just depends on the volunteers. We did have 2 contractors there, but it just depends on the volunteers.
It sounds like for disaster response that it's not the physical labor, it's more about being the hands and feet of Christ, and Him using you with your gifts, helping to train others, even being able to teach me how to hammer a nail to be able to help. But it's all to glorify the Lord and to be able to show to the people that you help.
Yeah, Tracy, when I'm a site manager and I do the morning brief, I talk about rules of the site, and one of the last things I talk about, the last rule, is while you're on site, while you're working in the area, if all your thoughts, your words, your actions glorify Him who sent us, I don't have to worry about them. But doing that, the volunteers are watched by those around. Volunteers may not see anybody watching them, but they are being watched. And if somebody from a Christian organization starts cussing and cursing and doing things, they explode that as, all those hypocrites, they're really not Christians. That doesn't paint the picture that Christ wants us to paint. He wants to glorify him in all that we say and do. And we had an incident in Andrews, South Carolina at their flood. Our volunteers had gutted the house in the process of rebuilding, and they put furring strips up on a concrete wall. Well, the concrete was so hard that even using a nail gun, like 1 in 3 would actually take. And they had half a room together, and we had an inspector come by, and we do, when we rebuild homes, we have inspectors come by to inspect things that needed to be inspected, electrical installation, things that are required by that community. And he said, oh, you guys have to take the furring strips down because they are not pressure treated. So knowing how hard it was, this team didn't say a bad word, didn't complain. They took it all down, put it all back up, and they were being watched. And I got a letter after the home was completed about that episode. And the homeowner said he was amazed that these folks didn't curse, didn't get mad, didn't call the building inspector crazy. They just did what they needed to do. They were happy about it, pleasant about it. He was just so amazed that we mirrored Christ in that little slip of time. And that's what is a great story of how disaster response is reaching out to the demonstration of Christ's love in what we do, so that we get an opportunity from somebody to ask us, why are we doing this? And we're doing this because we're commanded to love our neighbors ourselves, to love one another as he loved us. Those are commands that we were given by Christ. And that's what we want to do. We want to share the gospel as much. And I tell my volunteers, if they spend all day crying, laughing, singing, praying with a homeowner and get very little work done, they've had a great day.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Rick, you want to add to that?
No, I would just add, one of the things I always tell people, if they want to share, if somebody, a victim of a disaster, wants to share with you, I always say when you get to the job site and if the homeowner is there, to ask if you can pray with them. I've never had anybody turn me down on that, regardless of what Wolf Blitzer says. Anyway, it's and then ask them if they would like to share what happened. Where were they during the disaster? They need to talk about that and get that out. And I always say, as Keith just mentioned, that's just as important as doing the work. So it's critical. And again, you represent your church, the church that we're hosted at. You represent the denomination. So please represent yourself well and give God the glory.
Amen. I have a question for both of you, and I'd like you to each answer what you think. Where do you see MNA Disaster Response going forward? What would be your personal desire to see MNA Disaster Response go?
Well, I would say, we want to do more training on equipment so that we can have a more robust impact, more training of site managers. We are, in addition to our 2 warehouses and depot, we're looking at a couple other locations that we could possibly set it up. It would give us a quicker response in those areas. And I think it just continuing to build a team, branching out, having more specialists and that sort of thing.
Along with that, we introduced several years ago a potential new type of team called Care and Comfort. And their role would be just to do what what Rick has, just mentioned about sitting along with a homeowner, asking them leading questions, listening to them, praying with them, especially immediately after the storm, where the impact is the greatest emotionally and sometimes spiritually, when they see their whole worldly set of possessions, stripped away from them. That's an area I'd like to see get more traction and go forth. The other thing Rick mentioned about moving, finding some new locations. We just started a campaign to buy a building or buy land and buy a building in Florida for a Florida depot, so that it doesn't take us 12 to 14 hours to get a piece of equipment from Rome down to South Florida. We'll have some of that equipment pre-staged with supplies and tools in Central Florida area so that we can get there. So that's being rolled out now. So if you're interested, contact me, and I'll get you all the information about where we're going with that and where we're at, because we just rolled it out in the last week or so.
Can you each give me 2 prayer requests that our audience can be praying for you about?
Well, I would ask for prayers that this Florida Depot project is blessed by God, is part of His plan that we do this, and it works, because we have seen how it has impacted His people with other depots in the warehouse. Plus, just pray for the upcoming storm season, that we are spared, if it be His will. And if it's not in His plan to spare us, that we do His work and glorify Him in all that we do during our responses.
Yeah. How about you, Rick?
I would say right now, pray for those churches that have been affected. For instance, Trinity Plano, their whole ground floor is going to be gutted. They're going to be out of that building for a year. Same down in the Woodlands, Christ in the Woodlands had 3 inches of water. Bethel had 3 inches of water. In Waco, our church, Redeemer, had water, plus the pastor's house was severely damaged. So just pray for those people. Pray for those, people who will be facing disasters this year, and pray that we would have more volunteers on a consistent basis, which is always an issue. We get a lot on the weekends sometimes, but then during the week, we could really be doing things. We don't have the volunteers. So, and just pray that whatever we do, we give God the glory. Amen.
Well, as we begin to wrap up here, I would say that my prayer requests would be that those of you in the audience would pray for MNA Disaster Response Director Ackley Hooton, Keith, Rick, Andy, Mark too, and did I miss somebody? Scott. And Pat. And also Sherry and Lisa and Lauren. That's our disaster response team. Please cover them in prayer. Keep them lifted up. Sometimes the men are really, and I say the men primarily, they're gone from home 6 months at a time. Sometimes they miss a grandbaby being born. They might miss an important birthday, but if you would just keep them lifted up in prayer and ask the Lord to keep them safe and healthy. My other thing that I would ask is that you do visit our website at www.pcamna.org, disaster response, and consider and pray about volunteering. Trust me, you don't have to have the skills. They will teach you. They can teach me how to do something. They can teach anybody how to. So go and register. They need your help. They value your help. but you will find that when you go, you will be blessed. So please consider going to our website and visiting to volunteer. I want to thank MNA Disaster Response Director Arkley Hooten for letting me have you two gentlemen this afternoon when he probably had other work for you to do. And Keith and Rick, I want to thank you so much. You guys know how much I admire what you do and have a whole lot of respect for you. And the biggest thing I can say is you guys always really do exemplify Christ, no matter where you are. And for that, we give God the praise. I want to thank all of our attendees today. If you have any more questions, Keith and Rick both have posted their email address. Write down their email address and please contact them by email. They will be happy to respond back to you. Other than that, I'm going to say to you, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to invite you to join us next week when we have our webcast, The Blended Church, and that will be focused on 10th Presbyterian Church. And other than that, I'm going to say thank you and we'll say goodbye.
And one thing I want to add is we could not do this without Tracy. She is so supportive and answers all our questions, and I really thank her.
You're kind. Thank you. But thank you, everyone. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.